I'm Dave Magos, Morningstar Farms. Um, Milk 850 cows. Well, we were milking 850 cows before the pandemic hit. We're down to 800 now, which is kind of unprecedented in the dairy world to shrink a dairy herd. We crop about 2,600 acres, pretty much 100% no-till, cover crops on every acre if we can. Sometimes in the fall it gets late and we don't always get a cover crop on every acre, but we do our best to do so. Picture on the left is myself and my youngest son, and the picture with the water in the background, I like to say that is Lake Ontario in June, just to kind of give you a kind of visual of what we deal with. It's actually an iceberg in Alaska, but that's a whole different story. We got some sunflowers, some cover crops, and just pictures of what we do. This is where we're located on the eastern end of Lake Ontario. It is about a mile, not quite a mile from the lake itself. So we get the cool springs. The lake stays cool in the spring. Wanted to no-till for a long time, thought it would be interesting, thought it would be the way to go. Didn't think we could make it work because of the lake and our climate. Just another visual of what we deal with. 6 months out of the year, we can have snow on the ground. This picture was taken basically from the front yard. It's looking at the same field. Just, November, April, we have snow. Another climate picture. This was in June of 2019. It was a wet year, but that's supposed to be a cornfield. There's some cover crop trying to grow. This was taken behind the one freestall barn. The biggest thing I think it takes to make no-tilling work, or basically life, is your attitude. If you say, like I used to, that I would like to no-till, but I can't make it work because, you're probably right. If you take the attitude, we're going to make this work because, and you figure out the weaknesses, figure out what's holding you back, it will work. Just another kind of a visual of the star is home base, and then those red dots are different locations. The ones farthest over on the right are about 25 miles from home. Again, if we were conventional tillage, we would not be farming that ground farther from home. Just the logistics of moving equipment back and forth would not allow that to happen for us. But with a no-till, we can bring the planter 25 miles from home. We've got a couple different farms over there that are 100, 150 acres. We can get them done in a day or so and then be moving on. And usually with one guy running the equipment, one guy for support. So that makes it work for us. And just this picture is every little red number is a field number that we farm. Just another visual of what we do. Crops that we grow this past year is about 900 acres corn for silage and grain, a couple hundred acres in soybeans, 100 acres of wheat, 600 to 700 acres of what we call dairy hay put up for the milking cows, and then the balance is just grass hay that gets put up for heifers and dry cows. No-till and cover crops for about 15 years, and the synergies of the two really work well together for us. Picture on the left is the grain drill. The picture in the middle is a radish cover crop, and then the picture on the right is what the soil looks like. I've been told by a few guys that really know what they're doing, they say your soil should look like coffee grounds. That is a description that they use, and that is just a picture. I was scouting some corn this fall to see if it was ready to start chopping, and that's what the ground that I was walking across looks like. So we are accomplishing that, and most of that is like worm casts. That's what the worms are doing for us.
Dave, why don't you tell us why you first went no-till at first?
Okay, so the kid on the right is my 26-year-old son. He is on the autistic spectrum, and he was a little guy. I mean, he was 10 or 12 years old, and he came to me one day and wanted to know if we could talk. And I said, sure, what's up, bud? And he proceeded to tell me that he wanted to farm, and he loved doing the farm work, but he did not want to have ownership or management responsibilities because he just does not like making quick decisions. He loves running equipment. He loves seeing the progress we're making with the no-till, but he just isn't a decision maker. So that first year, my wife and I talked about it, and we rented some extra acres to kind of start building something for him. And we probably, I guess I rented more acres than I had equipment for. So as we got into the spring and we were kind of getting behind, a neighbor of mine had a no-till drill or no-till corn planter that he just bought, set up no-till, and I was talking to him one day and he said, "Well, come borrow this planter. You're welcome to use it." So we planted some corn no-till that year, and the first day I used it, I was probably off the planter more than I was on the planter, just kind of nervous about how it was working. It wasn't something I had done before. Wasn't set up the way we would do it today, but it did work. And that fall when we were combining corn, it was probably some of our best corn. So it's kind of like the little light bulb. It's like, okay, this can work. And then we did, to get at the same basic time, the youngest son he enjoyed deer hunting. So we hand spread some radish seed in one cornfield where there's a stone wall that when he was a little guy, he could walk back and forth behind the wall and the deer didn't really seem to see him. And it was a good spot for him. The next spring we were walking across that field and we could just feel something different under your feet. We couldn't put our finger on it at first. We were just walking across the field doing some scouting, and we came to realize that between the rows that we had planted the radishes, you could kind of see the radish marks where they had been growing, but that ground just had a more mellow feel to it. So we kind of put two and two together, and that's how we came to cover crops and no-till at the same time, and it worked out really well. And the cover crops do make excellent food plots for deer, so that works out quite well also. And actually, as a side note, for guys that rent land from deer hunters, the cover crops, they will get to the point that guys will say, "What are you planting on my property this year? I'd like you to plant some of this, or I'd like you to plant some of that," because that worked really well for the deer hunting. So it's a plus, I guess, if you will, for landowner relations. Picture of just the soil, what it looks like. You can't really see the worm holes in here, but there are some. You can see some organic matter being pulled down a hole in the lower left corner of that picture. Worm activity really accelerates when you go down this road. The cover crops, I believe, provide a food source for the worms, and it's just more of that synergies working together. This is a picture of some custom work we were doing for neighbors. This is just what fall can look like up here. So this is why sometimes if we get a little bit late, it can be a real challenge to get cover crops on. But there again, that goes back to that attitude part of it. If you work at it and you figure it out, there's a way to make it work. And the soil structure, as you go into no-till longer term, the soil structure just does seem to change and it carries better. So we have less and less of this kind of situation going on. Challenges with no-till and public perception. We have a disaster, I guess you would call it, every year with the no-till on a main road. I guess I don't generally try to hide my experiments, and we do what we do. The last 2 years, a field on the main road, a 40-acre field, has had a poor crop on it. The first year, 2 years ago, it was extremely wet. We were really late getting it planted. We averaged about 10 tons the acre on that field, and it looked bad, but the neighbor's cornfield that is the same size across the road, they never got planted, so they got 0 tons to the acre. So I guess I still consider the no-till a win in that situation. This picture is just my son chopping corn, and that is what our no-till corn looks like. That field was about 24 tons to the acre, so it works, and it works well for us. The challenges of cover cropping, the biggest obstacle early on was truthfully seed cost, trying to justify what some people look like. And when I say some people, my wife is the bookkeeper, and she's excellent at numbers, and she's like, this is not free. You're spending this many dollars on cover crop seed. It works out to this many dollars an acre. So a lot of conventional wisdom is that your initial tillage pass in the spring costs about $20 an acre. So I took that number and I was like, okay, if I can keep cover crop seed costs under $20 an acre, then I think we have a win on our hands, because we're eliminating many other tillage passes. So the cost of the seed initially was a stumbling block, and it still can get out of hand if you don't pay attention to what you're doing, but it's very easy to keep that cost in check now. Another picture of a cover crop field.
And ryegrass and radishes are ones you can
Yes, yeah, ryegrass and radishes are kind of our go-to for a couple of reasons. One, they are very aggressive at taking out compaction. They're a couple of the better ones that we have found, and they are also on the more economical side, seed cost wise. The radish, everybody looks at the tuber thinking that's doing all the work taking out the compaction. It's actually the taproot that goes down that drills through that hard pan that really does it for you. Annual ryegrass has a very fine root system, but it's massive and it will penetrate, and it does go deep. So that's been very effective for us. Soil structure, once you get into this and you start seeing what it's really doing for you, the structure, the infiltration rates, and the reduced erosion, it all comes together, and it's really working well. These two pictures here on the left-hand side is actually the field that I was talking about on the main road that we have a disaster on. That is water coming off of our field, and the neighbor's field is right next door, runs into the same ditch side by side. That is the water coming off of their field. Ours is definitely not 100% pure and clean, but you can see the green underneath. You can see through it. There's not near as much topsoil leaving the field as there is off the neighbor's field on the right. And this is just another same thing, another no-till field that we have in the neighbor's field that they farm right next to it that they do intensive tillage on. And this is a springtime, late winter, early spring rain, and this is just the amount of topsoil that are leaving those fields. This picture is not actually from our farm, but it's used to show what we're talking about for people that aren't really super familiar with it. But the corn, once the temperature gets above 86 degrees, I'm not sure the technical word, stome on the bottom of the leaves will begin to close to limit moisture loss in the plant, and then the leaves curl. And we had a really hot, dry summer this past summer again, and we had some neighbors commenting to me that our corn didn't seem to be curling near as bad. Well, it would curl, but it was a lot later in the day. It got to the point where by 11 o'clock in the morning, a lot of the corn in the neighborhood was just starting to curl up, look like pineapples, and ours might be 2 or 3 in the afternoon before it started showing that stress effect, and it would start to curl up. So it definitely, to me, indicated that there was more soil moisture available because we had the structure and the roots were able to get down to it. Just a wonderful picture of trying to move manure, and that's the realities of dairy farming. Broke through the frost, and there we sat. We actually had to call in a bulldozer with a winch to pull that out, which was not cheap, but we got it out. So there again, that attitude thing, it's like, well, this is kind of miserable, so what are we going to do about that? So we hired drag lining done, which actually worked very well. Pictures were both taken, late fall, early winter. We'd had a freeze, but there wasn't a lot of snow yet, a little bit of frost in the ground to carry the equipment. The downside to the drag lining for us was the economics of it, because it cost about $0.01 a gallon to move manure, and then the drag lining on top of that was another $0.01 a gallon, so it doubled our manure moving expenses. In many ways, you have to balance things back and forth. We continue to do some drag lining, but we limit it to the ground where we can move it out of the lagoon so that we're not paying the trucking expense and doubling our costs. This is one of those disaster fields I was talking about. The middle picture, actually, you can see the slugs feeding on the leaves. You can't see the slugs, but you can see the slug feeding on the leaves. Just kind of ragged, looks like it got hailed on. The picture on the left actually looks bad, but that corn that was a annual ryegrass field that was sprayed. That's what it looked like to start with, and we kind of were concerned with it, but it did come up through that and did quite well. Now the picture on the right, if you look kind of right in the middle of the picture, you can actually see a slug, and I don't know if you'll be able to identify it or not, but that was, picture we could find the slugs in the field. The population was so heavy, and the ground was wet. The cover crop had died, but it was wet, and it just made a perfect environment for those slugs, and that was part of our issue with that field. Elson Fields, entomologist from Cornell, did some of his nematode studies at our place. He did most of his research in the early years on the alfalfa snout beetle, and the nematodes were developed to control the snout beetles. The interesting thing that he was finding in our fields was that we didn't seem to have a lot of snout beetles, and I think he theorized that we had such a short rotation of 3 years of hay and then 3 years of corn that we just never let the populations get out of hand. But he also was not finding corn rootworm beetles. So he put a bunch of these tents out, and they did a 2-year trial here, and part of his research he was finding that the nematodes also control the corn rootworm beetles. They're controlling white grubs, which in the no-till is an issue. So we are using more nematodes, kind of natural control. We're distributing them across more and more acres on the farm. It just works well with the no-till, and it's takes some of the chemicals that we would have to use to control these insects out of the equation. So it's kind of a win-win all the way around.
How do you introduce the nematodes into
to do them the way they're originally, when Elson was having them done, is you use the crop sprayer, and you actually have to spray them at night, and it's pretty intense. It took 2 guys screening. They grow them on worms, and then you have to screen and clean flush them out of the worms, I guess, and then you put them into the spray tank that has been cleaned out so there's no chemicals in it, and then you go out and spend the night spraying the fields. They are doing some research now putting the nematodes right into the manure tankers, and that seems to be working out quite well. So more research ongoing, but it's a very positive trend, and it does work really well. This is a picture of our corn planter. I don't know if you'll be able to pick things out, but the very back end where those chains are hanging, those are called the closing wheels. And these were our early years of no-tilling, and we did a lot of trial and error on the farm, and you can maybe pick out, there's some like wheels that have spokes on them, and then there's some solid rubber wheels, and then in the center here of the planter we have it's called the Case International closing system, and there's some poly spike closing wheels on the right hand side. Just some on-farm research that we did to figure out what worked best in our situation. And that's the thing, that there's, like many things in life, there is no one cut and dried answer to what makes no-till work for somebody. I'll have people now call me, farmers, and say, hey, how do I set my planter up? What's the best way to do this? What's the best way to do that? And you kind of have to ask a bunch of questions and figure out what they're planning into, what their style is, what's going to work for them, because there isn't really one right answer. There are many right answers, and I guess you'd say many wrong answers. Back to that attitude thing, it's like, well, if you want a quick, simple answer, this may not work for you, but if you're willing to put in the time and do a little bit of research yourself to see what's working for you, then you'll probably have a better chance of being successful at it. Just the corn planter, those are the opening discs. We do not have any no-till coulters. Those were popular in the early years of no-till. Kind of the no-till coulter created the initial slot for the seed, and then these are called double disc openers. We've learned over time to get rid of the no-till coulter. It just causes more, I call it static or noise on the planter. We just change those discs every year. And the wheels, the rubber wheels behind them are the gauge wheels. They serve a couple purposes. One, it sets the depth of the seed, and 2, it cleans the disc openers off. So you have to get those set. Basically every year we tear the planter apart right down to the shank, which is what holds the discs together. and then we rebuild the planter to make sure everything's nice and clean and tight and works the way it's supposed to. And being that we don't have a lot of tillage equipment that we need to worry about, we spend our time and money on the corn planter that does all the work for us. There again, more things that we change as we go. The picture on the right, the gauge wheels, you can see the black wheel has a solid center in it, and as that scrapes the mud off the disc blades or any sticky soil, it'll accumulate inside of that wheel. So the answer is on the left hand side, you can see the black wheels, they have cutouts in them so that it lets it shed the mud. Just kind of something that's came onto the scene in the last few years, really big time. And we tried it on a few rows, and it's like, yeah, that's actually, it works better, because as the mud builds up behind those gauge wheels, sometimes it tends to spread them away from the disc, and then the disc doesn't get cleaned off like it should, and you end up with a muddy mess. And just something as simple as cutting holes out there to let it shed the mud and clean out makes a huge difference. And this is just a picture again on the back of the corn planter. When we started out, we were trying to put nitrogen beside the seed and below the seed, fairly deep, 4 or 5 inches down. It was a lot of stress on the planter, took a lot more power. We attended a few different conferences, and I was talking to some guys that had numbers to back up what they were saying, and they were saying, we're just putting the nitrogen out the back for the pop-up to get the plant started. And in the no-till situation, back to that water infiltration, you have better infiltration. The liquid fertilizer seems to soak into the ground fairly quickly. They're not losing a lot of it. They said their yields were just as good or better as when they were doing the deep placement. Speeds things up, and there's a lot less maintenance. So that's just a picture of how we put our nitrogen on now. It just comes out behind the closing wheels, and that drag chain just kind of bounces along and mixes it with the soil a little bit, and it works very well. The top middle of this says singulation, and I see that my picture showed 99.8, but this is not my screen because I don't have a vacuum planner, and I see this is showing vacuum. But that's just to demonstrate that a finger pickup planter, a 16-row planter, so it's fairly sizable. Finger pickups are old technology, and we were able to hit 99.8% singulation, which is a really good number. So it's just, I guess the point of that picture was to demonstrate that you don't have to have the fancy newest equipment, that you can take pretty much any equipment and you spend the time working on it and working with it, and you can achieve good results. And that is where the red arrow is, there's a corn seed in the ground. In front of that, the top of the picture has already been planted, and that is just kind of what our ground looks like after we plant. You can't really see where the corn planters went through. It's like minimal disturbance, so you don't have, I guess, you're not disturbing a lot of soil, you're not destroying a lot of structure, you're not exposing yourself to a lot of erosion. And that picture is one that we took while we were planting corn. And here's another picture. I like this one better because it almost looks, as you look at this, you can see where the planter went through on this one. It's a little different angle, but the top of the ground, it just looks, not sure what word I'm looking for, but it looks like we're creating topsoil. Instead of destroying it, you can just see the structure of that ground, and it's improving every year. It just gets better and better. And I guess I took the same picture twice just to demonstrate that I think we're definitely moving forward, and we're not losing topsoil, we're not losing organic matter, carbon, it's all staying in the soil. The 5 years on the left are out of our field. The 5 years on the right are from a neighbor who they are probably some of the top farmers in the neighborhood. My son was planting our field with our planter. They were planting their field at the same time right across the road. They're both 16-row Kinsey planters. My son was all excited because, the neighbors are out there doing it at the same time. And then these were years taken right before we chopped the corn, just to demonstrate that I don't think our corn is probably any better than theirs, but I definitely don't think that it's any worse. So there again, the no-till holds its own and is working. Picture of the grain drill, just kind of show the spike closing wheels. Actually, the gauge wheels on this one, we're actually changing them out this year to the open slotted gauge wheels to kind of improve the grain drill. And this is when my son had the scale that he was weighing seed. Collecting the seed can be a bit of a pain, and the boys one day had some water bottles with them, and they said, what if we just slide these up on there and see if they'll stay on? It would save a lot of time. So that was their innovation on how to collect seed that we then weigh. And they're, again, simple solution, but it sped things up, and it makes it so that you do it and you want to do it and make it right, do it right. And there's Brian again with the gauge. You collect the seed out of a certain number of tubes and weigh it just to see where we're at to get the drill calibrated right, so that we're not putting on too much seed, which costs money, or too little seed and you will not get the desired results. And that is another cover crop field.
Yeah, you can go faster these if you want.
And that's just what the cover crop looks like when it's getting established. This is crimson clover in the fall, and that is crimson clover in the spring when it actually makes it to bloom, which I think that is one of the prettiest crops out there. It's just a beautiful sight. One of those you need to stop and just spend a minute, look at it, and admire it. And that is planted the day before and then terminated. You can see it's kind of starting to wilt, but we plant right into that and get a successful crop. And that is an alfalfa seeding that was no-tilled in the spring. This picture is taken in the fall, so it looks good. Sun hemp plant, you cannot really make out the little nodules on the roots in this, but it's supposed to be, sun hemp is a warm season plant, so you have to plant it fairly early in the season, and it's supposed to fix a lot of nitrogen. So after wheat comes off in July, we'll plant some, plant a cover crop, a mix that has some sun hemp in it, just collects some nitrogen and has it available for the next year's crop. Seed tag, just the different crops that we plant. There's some oats, some spring peas, buckwheat. Buckwheat's supposed to help cycle phosphorus from deep in the soil profile and bring it up. Some green sugar, that's Sudax, just creates a lot of biomass. The sun hemp, sunflowers. Sunflowers we like to put in that summer mix. There again, it's a public relations thing. When sunflowers start blooming, people pull over, they will ask permission to go cut sunflowers. People just love them. They're just a attractive, pretty crop. And then we have some radish, some turnips in there just for compaction reasons. The spray, that's a picture of our sprayer. We are working on that, trying to be able to establish waterways within the fields and not have to spray around them and make an extra, take extra time. You can just go straight back and forth. Each nozzle has an individual solenoid on it that turn on and off by GPS signal. We would never have been able to take on that project without the CSP program through the local NRC office, NRCS office. The cost to do that was, it was big, but it is working. It's not a completed process yet. We're still working on it. The sprayer is up at the local dealership right now, getting some more work done to it to try and improve the results, but it looks very promising. And this is a waterway, kind of the green stripe through the field, that we were able to establish and not have to do any extra work, I guess, if you will, while you were spraying. In season, when it's crunch time, you can just drive the sprayer straight up and back down the field, and the nozzles shut off. They do not kill the waterways out, and it's kind of in the concentrated flow areas where the water naturally wants to flow off the fields, and you start getting some erosion problems. This hopefully will control that, and we won't have the washouts or be losing any topsoil. Couple flyers, magazines that we buy our no-till parts from. There are companies that kind of specialize in no-till and have pieces and parts available to make your equipment work better. This is a picture of a field on a farm that we bought, and that is seriously what it looked like. That is the rock picking that we endured. And when my son planted that, he said, as long as we own this field, I will never plow it again or do any tillage, it will always be no-till. And the picture in the middle on the bottom there is he got to go out and use a conventional grain drill with the Packers, and he actually pulled his grandfather's old tractor out to pull the drill with. So it was kind of cool to get to see him do that. Picture on the bottom left was just our local DC from NRCS office. Got to be quite good friends with him before he moved up the food chain and moved away. But he was talking to Jason one day about muskrat trapping, so Jason invited him and his son. He said his son would like to see it, so they spent a weekend trapping with Jason. It was just kind of cool, something different. And my email address is there. If anybody has any questions or wants to tell me I'm wrong, you can just email me and I will eventually respond. Thank you.